Hi everyone, welcome to day 2 of the bootcamp. Just give it a second for a few people to join us and then we'll get started. So who is here today? Obviously, again, it's going to be myself and Tyler. As always, pop your questions in the question/chat box below. We've got Tyler and Peter here looking through all of that, making note of all your questions. And I will again do a Q&A at the back end of this session. So if I don't answer your questions throughout the teaching, it's because I'll get to them at the end. So if you haven't already, don't forget to join our Facebook group. So we did actually a live Q&A session in there today for the overspill of questions I couldn't answer last night, and I'll probably do another one tomorrow and probably every day after the bootcamp. But we're going to pop the link to the Q&A to the Facebook group in the chat for you guys. So any of you that aren't already members, go ahead and click that and get joined. And just to remind you all, we have got a competition running. So the competition is for a chance to win 1 year access to our core coaching and mentorship program, along with the weekly Q&A access that comes with that, our property development mastery program, plus a 1 hour one-to-one business planning coaching call with myself, a VIP invite to our Inner Circle networking event being held at the end of October with a total value of over £10,000. So at the end of this session, again, for any of you guys that didn't attend yesterday, we'll be showing you how to enter that. So just to recap, what did we cover yesterday? So obviously we introduced myself and the Property Development Bootcamp, so what we're actually trying to achieve over these next few days. We looked at the development process and we introduced our different exit strategies. We sort of established what was the most lucrative way to find our sites, and that is going to be the focus of sort of what we look at today, is those off-market direct-to-vendor sites prior to planning being approved. And then we had a look at finding and identifying these off-market opportunities using our mapping software, Nimbus Maps. And for any of you guys that didn't manage to attend yesterday or just wanted to recap on what we covered, the recording of that has been uploaded to my YouTube channel. So what we're going to cover today. Firstly, we're going to have a look at all the site checks and due diligence required to determine whether a site is still a viable opportunity. So obviously at this point you've identified opportunities based on what we learned yesterday, but there are actually a few stages sort of still to figure out whether or not that's actually viable. How we approach our landowners to express the interest in the land. Understanding some basic design principles and how this links into designing an initial site layout, because if you remember, these sites that we're looking at don't have planning and therefore very rarely are they going to have any drawings with them. And then importantly, how to conduct a full financial appraisal to understand what that parcel of land is worth. So what is the sort of workflow behind the next few steps? So we've identified opportunities. That was, like I say, sort of the focus from yesterday's session. The next step is to approach the opportunity as well as any of the relevant follow-up letters. You'll then do some site checks and due diligence. Now, these two stages, the approach, opportunity, and the site checks, can be done you can switch their order around. Some people do all the site checks first and then approach. Some do some site checks, then approach. Some approach and then do all the site checks. That's sort of more of a personal preference. We'll then design the initial scheme, conduct a full financial appraisal, and then finally enter into negotiations. So, approaching the opportunity. Now, I wish I could say there was just a standard letter that gets everybody to respond to you on the first approach, but that isn't the case. Really, it's somewhat trial and error, tweaking the letter each time, tweaking your stationery to improve it to try and get that response rate up. But systems are very important here. We recommend the use of a virtual assistant to actually populate your spreadsheet from the title registers and to mail merge them into your letter. So if we just have a quick look now, if I just bring up on Nimbus a title plan, for example.
So just for context, for those people that didn't make it or haven't yet been able to watch yesterday's workshop yet, so at this point we've identified some potential development opportunities, and the next step is like Rosey said, to approach them. So this is a title register for the property, and this essentially has all the legal information relating to the property, and importantly, the most important piece of information we're looking at is who is the registered owner. So it costs about £3. It costs £3 to purchase and acquire this title register, and what we then want to do is approach the landowner to express our interest in their land. So what Rosey's showing here is a title register, and then if we find...
So basically the most important part, well, at least at this stage, we'll talk about this again in a second with the site checks, but the most important thing you're looking for is under sort of the title absolute section, is this proprietor, because that basically tells you who owns that parcel of land. So in this situation, it's owned by a company, and it tells you, the registered address of that company. And essentially what you're going to have your virtual assistant do is take this information here, which could be just one landowner or multiple landowners, and input it into a spreadsheet that looks like this. So this is obviously a spreadsheet that we provide, but some people create their own. Letter reference, so that when someone calls in, you might send 100 letters out, so it's important you can identify exactly what letter in question. The address of the site here, the details of the owner, their correspondence address, your initial approach date, and then importantly, that's going to tell you when you need to do follow-ups in relation to your first letter. And then with virtual assistants, we'd have them populate this information, because it's a very sort of laborious task otherwise. And then we also have a mail merge add-on that we recommend that you use, because that just means you can straight away merge, if you've got 100 of these filled out, straight away merge that into your standard letter template. So again, you haven't just got to sit and populate a letter by hand, because that would take you a very long time. So like I say, that's sort of our recommendation. And when it comes to the standard letter, we've played around with stationery quite a bit, haven't we, to get the response rate up. There's a few things I recommend, and that's basically the key thing is you just need someone to pick up the phone to you, and sometimes that just starts with them even opening the letter. So little things like actually using a real stamp rather than a franking machine, or better quality envelope or a coloured envelope, just so it stands out from like the bills basically.
If you want to go a step further as well, if there is a prime piece of land you've identified that maybe you approached a couple of times and never had a response from, a great thing to do is handwrite the name and the address onto the envelope. Even handwrite the letter if you want to go that far, but you've got to imagine, I'm guilty of it now. I get so much post, and
I never open post.
Yeah,
unless it's something interesting looking. And
it could be spam from the banks that always send it to you, or sometimes letters from HMRC that can sometimes make your heart drop a little bit, just not know what's inside, but never had anything too scary from them. But a lot of the posts, just unless it's really stands out, and if I was to see something that's handwritten, or even if it just says private and confidential handwritten onto it, it encourages me to open it. And like Rosey said, the intention behind the letter is, one, to express your interest, but also to just get them to book a call. It's not to sell them on you, sell them on what you want to do. It's just get them on a call, so you can then pursue further. And the follow-up is so important, because
most responses come from the follow-up. I think when you get when a landowner gets the first letter, they probably think, oh, okay, yeah, it's just everyone's getting this letter. But when they get a follow-up, that sort of importantly tells them that no, you are interested specifically in their land. So it's not uncommon for a lot of landowners to actually only respond to a follow-up.
Well, one thing we've done in the past as well goes back to the point, if there is a specific site you're after. You can sort of mention in the letter that you've done a bit of homework on it already, and I think the dialogue we've used before is, if you'd like to find out what we're prepared to offer on the site, we've done a bit of work already, we've done a few hours of work already, please give us a call. And we've noticed there's a lot of people that call back and say, oh, I see you've done a bit of work, where did it get to, what did you think?
To be fair, and occasionally I'll do it again if I'm not getting a response from a piece of land that I'm really interested in. I'll actually do my appraisal work up front, and I'll actually say, we'd be looking at an offer in the region of X, because sometimes landowners think, oh, you're only going to offer us £50,000 or whatever figure they've got in their mind, and all of a sudden you could put a figure over to them and they think, oh, actually, yeah, no, for that sort of figure we would be interested in, they give you a call sort of thing. And yeah, the money's in the follow-up. Can't stress that bit quite enough. Okay, so site checks and diligence. So even if a site complies with the planning principles discussed in workshop 1 yesterday and has precedent, it does not necessarily mean it's a viable opportunity worth pursuing. Further checks are required, and these include, maybe you guys just guess in the chat whether or not you can figure out any of. There's
a 3 or 5 second delay between what we're saying and what we see on the chat, but yeah, we obviously went through yesterday the planning principles and the different types of sites, but doesn't necessarily mean it's a viable opportunity. So we just wanted you guys to guess what some of the site checks are, things you have to check about a parcel of land or a site before.
TPOs, yeah, that's one of them. Who said that?
A steps said TPOs, tree preservation orders.
Correct, one of the, I'm trying to think how many we have.
Easements. Yeah, that comes under title register.
Comes under title registers, yeah.
Badger rights.
Badger rights is a bit more of a niche one. Floodplain, correct, yeah, that's one of them. Listed status, yeah, correct.
Contaminated land.
Yeah.
Access is a big one. Well done, Christian. Well done, Dean.
Listed, yeah.
Mines. Yes, depends on the seriousness. Obviously, Coventry is a good example, but a lot of the time that doesn't really affect whether you can go ahead with it. It just maybe affects how you do the build.
Yeah.
So I think was it Corley Gardens or the Oaks? That's on coal mines. Corley's on
Corley Gardens, yeah.
Bats.
So bats wouldn't be until later on. That would be basically an intrusive test. Title register, yeah, well done. Area of natural beauty, well done.
Well done, Jack. Jack obviously knows his stuff.
Yeah, there you go, Jack. I was just about to say, Jack, well done to Jack. Jack's one of my students. No wonder he smashed them all out the park there.
Yeah, so let's go through them.
Yeah, okay, right. So, access. So this is a few things around the access. First of all, can you gain access into that site? In the sense, is it wide enough for access, and is there any ransom strips preventing the access to the site? And also, does that access have the correct sort of visibility, to be, safe for highways? The title register, so is it a clean title, or are there any restrictions on the title? So you're going to be looking for things like a unilateral notice, easements, as someone mentioned, and the biggest one is any restrictive covenants that could prevent the development of that parcel of land. So sometimes there's covenants saying that you literally can't develop it, or limiting the amount of development on it. Planning history, I don't think anyone clocked that one in the chat. So is there any planning history on the site? Now this planning history doesn't mean it's viable or not necessarily. There could be a load of refusals, which mean you think actually not going to bother, but it's good to get context of the site. Flood zones, so does the site sit in a flood zone? Are there any listed buildings on or around the site? Conservation area, Greenbelt, tree preservation orders, that's our TPOs that people mention in the chat, contamination, and asbestos. So yeah, access, is there adequate access to the sites? Like I mentioned, is it the correct width, and are there any ransom strips preventing you being able to get through to the access? Is the title clean? So like I say, that's your covenants, easements, or unilateral notices. Planning history, what is the planning context of that site? Is there any Lapse planning, approved planning, is there any planning applications ongoing on it? Or importantly, was there any refusals on that site? Flood zones, does it sit in a flood zone? Are there any listed buildings on the site itself or in the surrounding area? Does the site sit within a conservation area? So a conservation area could be something like an area of outstanding natural beauty. Someone, Jack actually said that in the chat. Sites of specific scientific interest, that could be that they've got particular geological traits to them that need to be protected. Or it could just be a smaller conservation area. So a lot of towns have small conservation areas within them that have particular architectural merit that the planners will want to preserve. Greenbelt, so does the site itself sit within the Greenbelt? So for those of you that don't know, the Greenbelt is a highly protected form of open countryside. Are there any tree preservation orders on this site? So is there any protected trees that you can't fell without prior planning approval? Contamination, is there any potential contamination on that site? Now, admittedly, you can't do an intrusive test to confirm contamination, or if so, what contamination, but you can have a look at previous uses to sort of indicate, could there be contamination? And then asbestos, again, you can't do the intrusive test, but by looking at the age of the buildings, asbestos was banned in the UK in 1999 within construction. So if a building was built pre-1999, that could indicate asbestos was there, particularly if it was a commercial property. So I think we'll just quickly do, let me get my mouse, there we go. We'll have a little look at that before we move on. So if any of you remember yesterday, I brought up this site on Nimbus when we were doing the site checks, and I actually said this is a good one for the access. Now, just before we move on, can anyone, I think I just gave it away then actually, I said what the issue was.
Well, whereas it wasn't, I don't think.
I didn't specific, I'll give you a clue. It's an issue with the access on this site. So at first look, this site looks viable. So just for context, we're looking at this parcel of land.
So we asked yesterday, what is the issue? There was a few guesses. I've actually got the name here of someone that did guess it correctly. But if any of you can figure out the reason, or want to take another guess at the reason why maybe the access isn't possible.
Mark said... Yes, Mark said it was the access, and it is the access, but can anyone guess specifically what about the access now that I've said the key access points that you're looking at?
Okay, we've had a few people guess it correctly. Ed, well done Ed, and well done Jack. There's a ransom strip to the left.
Yeah.
So did you want to explain what a ransom strip is?
Yeah, so a ransom strip, basically it ransoms the site. It's exactly that. So a bit of a broader context to this parcel of land. You can't gain access via this road here because this is, as I mentioned yesterday, a Morrison superstore, and this is their sort of delivery loading zone. So you obviously couldn't have a residential access through here. It's in quite a low value area of Coventry, and this would be what we call an affordable housing site. So the site can't afford to knock down one of these houses at the front that would access via Parkgate Road. So, although you could, in theory, let's say knock down one of these semis, to do so would render the site unviable from sort of like an economic terms. So the only other access is via Aldgate Close here, which is actually a previous Taylor Wimpey development. So you'd access it across this, via this close basically, and have the access coming in here. But if you actually zoom in, you'll see there's a slither of land just there, which sits right between the access road we need and the site in question. And basically what this means is unless you own this slither of land and this site, you can't access this road. You could, it literally only probably 2 foot wide, this piece of land, but without it, you're not allowed to build over it. So you can't develop this site without owning this little strip of land, and basically by doing so, this little strip of land ransoms the development site in question. So Yeah, that's basically how you'd check for the access. You're looking for things like exactly that, a ransom strip. You're looking to see, can you get access in? Obviously, let's say this ransom strip didn't exist, then yeah, you would say you've got clear access in via Allgate Close.
So someone asks, why not just then buy the ransom strip? Why not buy the slither of land?
Yeah, so that would be the mitigation strategy. Is you would say you would either approach both landowners separately and buy them, or you would say to the landowner of the main parcel of land that you would buy their land for, let's say, £500,000, on the basis they also acquired, they went away and acquired the ransom strip. Now, I actually know in this situation these two landowners won't come to an agreement. So this site has sat like this for many years because an agreement can't be come to. So this little strip of land does ransom the development of this site and has done for probably 10 years now.
So Ben asked, how much would that strip be worth? Well, it just completely depends on what they're willing to sell it for and how much the main landowner with a big chunk of land, I guess, is going to compromise on his price. That main landowner is essentially...
This land, to put it simply, this land's worthless as development land without this ransom strip. So you could argue this ransom strip's worth the entire development site. But equally, unless this site gets developed, the ransom strip doesn't come into use. So this is where the relationships between landowners is really important, because if these fall out, like in this exact situation, you end up with a stalemate of, well, my land's worth more, and actually they're only worth the land value combined, and it's how you split that up basically to come to an agreement. But yeah, you can buy it, but by the fact they ransom it, they have the cards in their hands basically, which is sort of somewhat ironic given how small a piece of land it is. But then in terms of your other site checks, you can do a lot of them actually on Nimbus here. So as you can see, you can look at the planning history, listed building, flood zones, environmental, so that's things like the Greenbelt or area of natural beauty, all can be checked actually on Nimbus. For things like contamination and asbestos, my recommendation is actually to go on Google Earth, go on the historical maps view, go back in time, and then you can see what was historically there, and that can give you an indication as to potential contamination or asbestos. And then just the title, you'd obviously buy the title and you'd be looking for key things. And actually, this one I brought up earlier, I know, has a unilateral notice, which basically means someone else controls this parcel of land, not the landowner. And in this situation, it's BDW Trading Limited, which stands for Barrett David Wilson, which is a large house builder. So that basically tells you that that piece of land, although it's not owned by a house builder, is controlled by a house builder. So you probably wouldn't approach it. Anything you want to add before moving on?
No, I think just in terms of maybe if we go back to the list of the all of these, just to run through where you can initially find do each checks. Access, like we just looked at, is pretty much Nimbus. I'm looking at
Nimbus,
that.
yeah.
And also then, I guess you can use Nimbus. There's a measuring tool. Some access you've got to obviously measure is it wide enough?
Yeah.
And we'll get on to sort of visibility displays shortly as well, which is something that you have to take into account, but that's more around the design. Title register, simply put, you pull up the title register and you can have a look at some initial key issues. Again, a solicitor sometimes will always do a title check and make sure there's a clean title and they'll be able to understand it. Planning history, Nimbus, flood zones, Nimbus, or there are flood maps online, listed buildings.
Nimbus, conservation area, Nimbus, Greenbelt, Nimbus, tree preservation order. You'll actually do that on the local authorities' planning maps. And then contamination and asbestos, like I mentioned, on Google Earth. Although contamination and asbestos, you can only indicate as to their presence rather than confirm. To confirm the presence, it'd have to be an intrusive test on site. Okay, so, right, just sort of going back to that drawing earlier. So we're now at the point of having done, so to speak, our site checks and due diligence. So we've found the opportunity, we've approached the opportunity, hopefully had a response. We've done our site checks and due diligence just to either rule the site out because maybe, let's say the whole site sits in a flood zone 3, it's flood zone 1, or it might, might have the whole site be covered in TPO trees, and you think, actually, I'm not going to be able to have them removed, so you're actually not going to pursue the planning or pursue the option, the site as a viable option. Or you actually are just going to do the site checks and understand actually there is one TPO tree, but it's in the corner of the site. So it's not going to stop you pursuing it. You just have to bear it in mind, sort of drawing the design and whatnot of that site. So yeah, the next stage is, like I say, is design the initial scheme, conduct your full financial appraisal, and then make an offer and enter negotiations. So what are the key design principles that you need to consider before you actually draw up a initial scheme? So obviously, like I mentioned, these sites you're looking at don't have planning, so you don't have drawings behind them. They are just parcels of land. So in order to figure out what that land is worth, you first of all need to go back a step and think, well, what can actually fit on the parcel of land? And to do that, you need to do a bit of a drawing, but how do you know what to draw without knowing some sort of basic rules, I guess? So a few things I look at is the access road. So we obviously know we can get access at this point from our site checks. So you're going to consider, is it going to be a adopted or a private road? And the key difference is the width. So normally say sort of 4.5 to 5.5 meters wide for a private road, and a good allowance of 10 meters, between 7.5 and 10 meters wide for an adopted road, depending on whether or not it's going to have sort of a path either side of the road. Bell mouths. Now, you don't need to know too much about a bell mouth, and I'll show you what these are in a second. But basically, the bell mouth is the standard road construction where two roads meet. So as you can imagine, you never have like a perfect right angle on a curb, because that would be very unnatural. So it's just, is there the space for this bell mouth? Very rare is it that there isn't the space, but it's just a consideration. Visibility displays, so this is there the safe access required into the site. Turning heads, so a requirement of planning is that refuge vehicles, so basically like a bin vehicle or a fire truck, fire engine, that's the word, ambulance, anything like that. If they go into a site, so if it's an adopted road, they have to be able to go in and leave in a forward gear. They can't go in and reverse out. They have to be able to turn around within the site. So you need what's called a turning head. Your separation distances, so the minimum distance between your different properties, and then the sort of size is needed for gardens and driveways. When you put all of this together and all the key sort of points behind each of these, it gives you the basis to be able to basically draw a site. So before we actually sort of draw, don't have my mouse. Let me just zoom out of that just so that I can sort of show on my mouse. Too close. Okay. So first of all, our access roads. So this is a site layout where there is both a adopted and a private drive. So the private drive is the one you see here, and the one you see at the back of the site. So as you can see, it's a lot thinner, and it doesn't have the pathways either side that the adopted road has. So the main body of the site is served by this adopted road, and only a few of them off of the private drive. And the bell mouth is this construction that you see here. So it's this sort of flare out. So it becomes wider than the actual road itself to allow for that sort of natural swoop into the road it's joining. And the turning head is this situation that you see here, where basically, if you can imagine my mouse was a car, you could come up here, reverse back, and drive out forward, allowing for that sort of turning head. Visibility displays. You can approach it from sort of a common sense view. If you were to sit yourself in the driveway or the road that you were proposing to be the new access road and look left and right onto the road you were proposing to join, if you were in a car, would you feel comfortable just straight away sort of pulling out, or is it one of those junctions where you'd have to sort of inch out because you can't quite see? If you can't quite see, that normally indicates there's a visibility issue. But the technical requirement is that depending on the speed of the road, you need to be able to see further, because of course cars travelling faster need longer to stop, and this distance that you need to measure being the Y distance, which is the Y distance is what is determined as being sort of adequate visibility display is always measured from a setback distance of 2.4 metres, because that's deemed where most people would be sat in their car, if that makes sense. So it's not measured right at the front, there's a bit of a setback to it. So from there, looking left and right, can you see the distance required in order to make a safe manoeuvre onto that road? Separation distances, so the distance between properties. So there's a few key ones, and the minimum distance from the front and a front-facing property and the rear of another property is 22 metres. So if you can imagine, basically it's sort of to prevent too much overlooking into one another's properties. So that's 22 metres. There's no minimum distance between the sides, so gable end to gable end of house, because obviously you could have a row of terraced houses. But if you do want sort of a side pedestrian access or like an alleyway, typically you say a metre. Some people go as small as 0.75 metres, but typically a metre, because you can get a wheelie bin up the side then. Properties built next to each other cannot pass the 45-degree rule, and I'll explain what that is in a second. And the minimum distance between the gable end of one house and the nearest habitable window of the next. So the gable end is the flat side wall, basically, and a property facing in on that is 13 metres. So the 45-degree rule is basically that when you build a house next to an existing property, if it's a single-storey dwelling that you're building, the furthest point forward of that property cannot protrude past the 45-degree angle of the house next door to it, and that is measured from the midpoint of the nearest window. So as you can see here, the midpoint there, draw a 45-degree angle past from that point, and basically your house can't protrude past that, otherwise it's seen as sort of overdevelopment. If that property you're building is 2-storey, that 45-degree angle has to be moved from the middle point to the quarter point of the closest window. So that's just a few of the design principles. Like I say, there are a few more, but that's the main ones. So how do we actually design the site, I guess? Here's one I prepared earlier. Tyler and I were having a heated debate.
Here's a question for the chat. Yeah, just before this live stream, Rosey and I were debating. Here's one I prepared earlier. What TV show was this term first used on, or famously used on?
I'm saying Art Attack.
I want to see what the chat says, and then obviously we'll reveal what we thought. But
Peter, who works for us, thought it was Big Cook, Little Cook, which is obviously wrong.
Okay, we've got some answers coming through.
Art Attack. Because he's like, right, we do it like this, and then he just whips out one.
Okay, we've got one vote for Blue Peter, 3 votes for Art Attack.
Told you. Thank you everyone that voted Art Attack. I was correct. Moving on. Here's one I prepared earlier.
There's more Blue Peter's votes for Blue Peter than there are.
We've moved on from it now. So yeah, here's one I prepared earlier.
We've polarised the audience there.
The most controversial thing said in a property bootcamp. So yeah, and I'll go on to ProMap in a second and actually show you the software in a little bit. But this is, I always call them my blobograms.
Ready, steady, cook.
Ready, steady, cook. Rogue. No. And basically what you're trying to achieve with this ProMap drawing is just to figure out roughly how many units you could get on a scheme. So this is just a piece of land we were looking at. It's actually a piece of land we're buying. And this is just a ProMap drawing that I did, applying those principles. If I just again click out so that I can use my mouse. So the access point was one that had the best possible access to highways because it was the right width. This becomes a very narrow carriageway here. It's going to be an adopted road, so it's built to the adoptable standard. The turning head is here at the back of the site. In reality, you might turn this into private drives just at the end. And then sort of the proposal I had was actually similar to the Corley Garden site. That's where I took a lot of inspiration for this blobogram you see in front of you, was actually I'd probably have another private drive serving just these two at the front. So if you take this as what sort of we drew versus what the architects then drew, you can see a lot of the sort of similarities. So they actually had it so it was just pedestrian access off the front, and they turned sort of this plot around. So it was actually the 5 affordable units on this site ended up at the front with pedestrian access onto this road and actually sort of access from the rear, and then the main adopted road becoming private at the end for these 4 bigger plots. So that's sort of how the two link, I guess.
I think a good term to use to look at is ribbon of development, which I guess is that referred to the
yeah, so if I just go on
the
to
neighbouring houses.
If I just go on to ProMap and actually show you this in the further context, as you can see, this sort of pattern of development is repeated a few times in this area. So, to have this development laid out like this doesn't look in any way unnatural. And also for anyone that's interested in what type of site this actually was a built-up boundary site because unusually, if I zoom out a little bit more, the town's envelope, I guess, if you were to call it that, extended straight off the back of these onto this road and then to the back of these. So this is just a plain field as it stands, but because it sits within that built-up boundary, it was automatically supported for development. So just in case you're wondering what type of site this was. But yeah, so basically ProMap, I won't do a full demo because that'll take me 2 hours, partly because I tend to be quite clunky on this software. You've got a few key features, but the most important one is you are able to draw. So you can draw shapes. So like your houses, for example, move them around on the page. That tells you the size of them. You can work between, I work in empirical, but some people work in metric. I've just moved my house. And yeah, you just play around with it until you get a design you like. I personally tend to sort of tweak it as I go. Some people create different layers or save multiple versions of the same map. Really, it's up to you, sort of what you would do. But just little things, for example, like you would make an allowance for your gardens. So one thing is gardens typically sort of a minimum of 10 metres. In this situation, we had the space to make them bigger. So obviously we know we've definitely hit the minimum separation, the minimum distance for a garden. Driveways. In this situation, we probably would actually have garages integral to the house, which is what the plan is for. So we don't have parking at the front of the houses. So we actually didn't have a driveway in that same situation here. And yeah, we've actually got, I suppose, in this layout, 3 house types. We've got a bigger one, which is 1,500 square foot, which if my proposal was initially 2-storey. But yeah, you have your different house types. You lay it out how you want. But fundamentally, you are applying those design principles like the turning head you see here to create a site layout. So once we've got a site layout, we know what can fit on the site. How do we know what it's worth? That's our appraisal. So, appraisal process. A financial appraisal is a document that allows you to calculate the land value and projected profit of a site by inputting all projected costs and revenue. These include, give people a second to pop suggestions in the chat.
Yeah, so obviously we get asked quite commonly, how do you calculate land value? And the first things a lot of people think of is, well, it's going to be worth X amount once it's finished. The build costs are going to be X, and therefore you can pay however much for the land. Now, build costs or construction costs is just one part of the financial appraisal. There are a lot of other costs involved, which a lot of people don't take into account or are unaware of. So if you guys want to put in the chat what other costs you guys can name that will go into an appraisal, we'll see what answers we get.
Yeah, any construction costs? Yeah.
Finance costs? Yep.
Professional fees? Yeah.
Ryan said SIL, which is Community Infrastructure Levy, and Section 106, so they're classed as contributions, which are a kind of tax that's paid. Legal fees, planning fees, correct?
Contingency, yeah. Stamp duty, yeah, that's a good one. A lot of people forget about stamp duty. Stamp duty is a tax you pay on land.
Marketing fees.
Yeah.
Utilities, they come under construction costs. Reports,
yeah. Developer profit, yeah, important.
That's, very important.
Hopefully there's a bit of that at the end. Affordable housing, yeah, so a allowance has to be made for affordable housing, if there is any, or you just have to check it.
So a lot of similar answers. Project management fees, PM fees, Mohammed mentioned.
Yeah.
Cost of architects, so that comes under professionals.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, well done. Okay, so the sort of standard headers we have, and I'll show you my appraisal in a second, are, so obviously first of all the gross development value, so what is that total site worth? Before you start putting your costs in, you need to know the total revenue from that site. The planning costs, so obviously again we're typically looking at sites that need planning, so what is that going to cost you? Contributions, so as you guys pointed out, section 106 and SIL. Abnormals, so I don't think anyone got that one, although I think that some people said like contamination. So abnormals will cover anything really outside the standard construction requirements. This could be contamination, it could be demolition, it could be cut and fill, it could be tree removals. It could be a number of things that basically fall out the remit of the normal construction path. Construction costs, so this is the bulk of the cost. This is the main build element. A contingency, professional fees, sales costs, the land acquisition cost, and then the finance costs, and then basically all these costs taken away from the obviously gross development value will give you the profit. And then we actually did touch on this yesterday, the a third rule, a completely urban myth, and never appraise a site based on it. This is the concept that of the total gross development value, a third of that is developer profit, a third of that is construction costs, and a third of that should be the land value, and that just isn't the case. Right, okay, so let's have a look at an appraisal. So actually this appraisal is an appraisal of that site we were looking at here, based on the architect's drawing.
Do you want to if you zoom in? If anyone's watching as well that maybe the screen's a little bit small, if you hover your mouse over the embedded live stream, there should be an option for you to make it full screen in the bottom right corner as well. So I know a couple of people have mentioned the screen's a little bit small, so you're able to make it a full screen if you can, if you'd like. But do you want to carry on?
So the first thing you need to do is understand what are those units worth, and we do that with our comparable research, which is basically you would go on to, I use Rightmove, you could use Zoopla or whichever software website, to look at basically what's sold in ideally sort of a 1 or 3 mile radius in the last 2 years, to basically understand what, if I was to build a 3-bed semi, what would that sell for in this area? Or actually, is even a 3-bed semi the right thing to build, because it might be all detached large family homes in that area, in which case you should probably be targeting that as well. So you do your comparable research, which all of this information that you see at the bottom is basically. Ultimately, that's going to feed through to my pricing schedule, which is what I think my units would be worth when they're built. That then links through to the main page, which is the financial appraisal. So on this top section here, we've got our gross development value calculations. So as you can see, the gross development value on this site is just under £6 million. So that's the value of everything when sold. So that's our starting point, and then we move through to our costs. So within planning costs, as you can see, some of you guys pointed out things like ecological surveys, bat surveys, noise surveys. You can sort of tweak and edit this as needed. I just either include or don't include a cost. Some people will delete it entirely. I like to leave it in, because then when a bank looks at it, they know I've considered it and chose not to put in a cost rather than just not thought about it. but personal preference. Section 106 and fill. So any contributions that are basically needed on the particular site. And then our abnormals, so like I say, I've put a few examples here: demolition, site clearance, asbestos works, contamination removal, removal of trees, non-standard services. So this would be things like ground source heat pumps or septic tanks. And then drainage, so if there's extra drainage needed or an extra large road or something, you would put that into your abnormals. Your construction costs, so personally I work at a price per square foot. So basically that means that it cost for the 3-bed dormer bungalow, it will cost me £125 per square foot to build that. I've got 5,340 square foot total of that house type. It's going to cost me nearly £70,000 to build those 3-bed dormers. Basically brings up my total construction cost, raw construction cost, to 2.5 million. On top of that, we add a contingency. So this is basically a buffer for things you maybe haven't allowed for, a bit of slippage, a bit of increase in cost, an extra 125,000. Our professional fees, so architect, engineer, employer's agent, quantity surveyor, CDM coordinator, which is sort of like your health and safety. Building warranty registration is what that is. We use NHBC or Premier Guarantee. Building regs, and project management fees. So that's your fee for managing the build, because you need to be paid for your work as well. Your exit costs, things like sales, show homes, estate agency fees, advertising, and then your legal costs on the exit. And then that brings you back to your site acquisition value, as well as obviously the costs associated with an acquisition, and then importantly what sort of debt that you're using. Obviously tomorrow we'll talk about the debt in a lot of detail. But basically the key thing is this pre-finance figure. So for a bank to be happy with funding a deal, typically they want to see between 20 and 23% as a minimum for this figure. So let's say, for example, I put this up to 1.5 million. That brings the profit down, the pre-finance profit down to 13%, which basically means this is a completely unviable deal. No bank would touch this deal. So when you do an appraisal, you put in all your costs and you originally start with a 0. So, obviously if we got the land for free, that means you've got a 39% profit. So the first thing to do is figure out, where does the appraisal break? I like to stick at the 23% because that means I've got all the panel of lenders if I'm at the highest viability point. So that's probably going to be like 950. There you go, bang on. 950,000 is pretty much there or thereabouts the maximum you could pay for this parcel of land. Obviously, depending on your strategy, you then have to work back from this. Obviously the assumption here is that the land doesn't have planning, so this is the maximum you'd pay with planning, so you've got to work back to a figure that you're comfortable with, and it might be that you start the offer at 650, remembering as well this is just a field, just a small field that's about 2 acres in size. It's hardly the most valuable thing on earth, so an offer of £650,000 is massive to that landowner. And that's a really good margin of 28%. You might even start lower, 450. Gives you a 32% margin. So that's the difference when it comes to buying a site with planning versus without. With planning, you'd be paying around 900. Without planning, you could probably acquire this site for around the £500,000 mark. And that difference in margin is absolutely massive and will completely alter the way you can fund this deal, which we will talk about tomorrow. But that's basically the appraisal process. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Just put some water in there for me. Thank you. So, purchase contracts. Thank you. So once you've actually figured out what the piece of land is worth, you then need to figure out, what's your offer. So that's sort of the appraisal process. And then you're going to make that offer, but on what purchase contract? And the key valuable thing in development is our option agreement. So this is a conditional purchase contract. An option agreement gives you the exclusive option, but importantly, not the obligation to purchase a property for an agreed price. Normally an option agreement lasts 12 months as well, so they're a lot longer than your standard purchase contracts. Therefore, the purchase itself can be conditional and subject to the planning permission being achieved on that site. So you'd only buy it as and when planning permission is approved. This means the land can be worth more at the actual point of completion than you agree to pay for it. So looking back at that appraisal, if you got planning before you completed on your option agreement, it would be worth that £950,000. But let's say you agreed the purchase at the £500,000 point. That means in that deal you've created £450,000 worth of equity, which is, the really valuable thing that I spoke about yesterday, that gives you so many options with exit, construction, funding, everything. And it's only possible because of the option agreement. Also, the contract can be assignable, meaning you can assign the purchase to a secondary developer, and that is how you would take that £450,000 land profit out of the deal, by assigning it over to someone else to essentially buy. We also have our exclusivity agreements. So exclusivity agreements technically aren't actually a purchase contract. Exclusivity agreement gives you a period of exclusivity, which prevents the landowner from entering discussions with other potential purchasers. So if you've got a site under exclusivity, that landowner can't discuss the sale of that with anyone else. So you've locked them out basically. And this will allow you to conduct further due diligence and finalise your negotiations without the risk of losing the deal. So if you had to maybe call on professionals, or you wanted to speak to the council about the site prior to entering into an option, you would do that with an exclusivity agreement, with the confidence that you could have those negotiations without being sort of sidelined by another offer from another party. So once you've done that, essentially, what would the next steps look like? So you would secure the deal with the necessary purchase contract. Now, as I mentioned, the sites we're looking at in the context of this bootcamp is those pre-planning sites. So in this situation, that purchase contract is going to be your option agreement. You would obviously get it under option, get the option agreement signed, and then you would navigate the planning process, if of course you didn't choose one of the earlier exit strategies. Thank you. You would then arrange the development finance from the banks prior to the point of completion, because obviously you need it ready for completion. If needed, you would raise finance from investors. Now we'll obviously talk about these 2 points, the development finance from the banks and raising finance from investors tomorrow. If needed, you would navigate further planning, depending on what planning you went for initially. And then complete and deliver the project. So, so that's, I guess, the core teaching for today. So that takes you from identifying a site all the way, hopefully at this stage you would have just completed on the project. Tomorrow we'll obviously look at the finance stage. So just at this stage, I want to remind you guys about our competition. So remind you of the offering, a chance to win a 12-month membership to our core coaching program, Property Development Mastery, all the teaching there, as well as the weekly Q&As with myself, a one-on-one coaching session with me, and a VIP entry to our Inner Circle networking event in October. So in order to enter the competition, you need to join our Facebook group, which a link to has been posted in the chat channel below this. And look out for the post that we're going to put up tonight after this webinar, asking you to share your light bulb moment. So the biggest takeaway from the training, the most key bit of information that really stuck with you. And for a bonus entry, post a photo of you doing the work with the hashtag do the work. We will announce the winner to our competition at the end of workshop 4 on Thursday. So before we get into a Q&A, just remind you of what we're actually going to cover tomorrow. So firstly, we're going to look at how to finance a property development deal using banks. So this is our standard development finance. How to raise private finance and structured deals with investors. How to raise finance legally and compliantly, so a really hot topic in development at the minute. And then importantly, how to attract the investors and get them to agree to work with you. So, should we open it up for questions for today?
Yeah, I think that's obviously quite an informative training today. That's the numbers, that's the due diligence. A lot of people think property development is just going out there and building nice houses and apartments, but there is a huge effort that has to go into the front end of acquiring a site, and these are the really important skills that can set you apart as a developer.
Yes, all of this that we've spoke about is only right at the very end would you have actually even purchased the site. You haven't owned the site up until this point.
Exactly.
So all that work's been done on a site you don't own.
But tomorrow we get into the part, the fun bit, where we talk about raising finance, speaking with investors, how do we structure deals with investors, what does that look like from a legal standpoint, and so yeah, I guess, if you're enjoying everything so far, we expect to see you tomorrow. We've got a number of questions that we've got throughout the thing, which I'm going to read out to Rosey now. If there's any more questions come through, throw them in the chat and we will
put it to the camera.
Yeah. Switch to the camera.
Do you want to join me again?
Just get in while I read the questions out to Rosey. How are we doing, everyone? Right. Okay, so Gerard asked, how do you quantify how many flats you can get onto a plot of land? Thinking of a city centre plot where a multi-storey / high-rise can be built, site size 1,400 square metres.
Yeah, so that's a slightly different ProMap process, and that is something we teach. Basically, you would have a building footprint, and within that you would use standard spatial sizes and circulation space sizes to give you an indication of roughly what each floor would be made up of, i.e. each floor will have 4 one-beds and 3 two-beds, for example. And then depending on what height you think would be allowed in that area, you would simply multiply that up. Might be, you can get 7 stories, in which case, obviously you would just do the maths to calculate, what does that mean in terms of number of units. But importantly, a key thing to be aware of when it comes to appraising apartments is the GIA and the NIA, so the gross internal area and the net internal area. You have to build the gross internal area, obviously, but you only sell the net or rent the net, because obviously you've got things like receptions, bin stalls, lift shafts, corridors in a apartment building that you don't have in a house. You don't sell the entire building, you sell the apartments. So yeah, it's just a slightly different appraisal process, a slightly different ProMap process, which is a bit more specialised.
Cool. David asked, if planning has lapsed on a site, does that mean you'll easily get planning passed again?
Yes, providing policies in the local plan haven't changed significantly. If any policies in the local plan have changed, which now mean approving that same previous approval would go against those policies. I've not explained that very well. So when it was approved, there was obviously one planning context. If now that local plan has changed and it has different policies within it, the previous approval could go against those policies. If that's the case, then it could be refused on the grounds that it no longer complies with policy. But providing the context of planning is much the same, yes, it should pretty much quite easily be approved.
Cool. Ben asked, with regards to site checks, how would one check whether a site would meet requirements to handle the likes of increased traffic, sewage, etc., which of course planners take into account?
So in terms of traffic, it's not normally a massive one. The biggest, it is a big one, but it's very rare that it's one that would prevent an approval. Where it's normally an issue is if you're trying to get a lot of traffic flow on a private drive. They normally don't like that. That's where they'll say they want an adopted road. If you didn't have the width, then that would become an issue at planning. In terms of services, you would do you'd get your utilities quotes and make those inquiries with Severn Trent, whoever, to give an indication. Basically, if the services couldn't manage it, you would have to pay for to upgrade the infrastructure, or you could have non-main services. So that's where, for example, if the foul drains couldn't manage a mains connection into the foul drain, then you could have septic tanks, for example, on site. So it's a private sewage system.
Okay. Next question is from Barclay. Where do we get our build cost price per square foot from? And Sina just asked a similar question. How can you accurately estimate the construction costs?
Yeah, so obviously your own sort of personal knowledge is one thing if you have it. So I tend to be able to quite give a good indication just from knowing the industry, what different types of product we built at in different areas. But one thing we have is our costing calculator. So that's a document we created alongside our employer's agent, which basically pulls all the information from the BCIS data to give price per square foot for different types of property across, there's hundreds of location factors across the UK. And basically you extrapolate that data up or down in line with the location factor. It's quite hard to explain it without having it on my screen. But that will tell you, if you obviously didn't have access to our costing calculator, then you would probably reach out to professionals if you didn't know yourself. So you could speak to builders, employers' agents, project managers, architects sometimes know if they're architects that are involved in the build out of things. But yeah, professionals would probably be your first point of call if you didn't have the knowledge yourself or sort of access to something like our costing calculator.
Cool. Ryan said we mentioned to look out for Greenbelt when doing site checks and looking for sites. However, we mentioned yesterday that the Oaks, the development that you guys did, was in 100% Greenbelt land. How did it obtain planning? Yeah,
so the Oaks was a previous builder's merchant. So it was actually a brownfield site. So as I mentioned, when it comes to Greenbelt, I'd only entertain brownfield sites in the Greenbelt. So both the Oaks and Corley Gardens were brownfield sites. So the Oaks was a builder's merchant and Corley Gardens was a garden centre, hence the name. So yeah, they were brownfield sites.
Paul also asked, which has been a common question, how are we dealing with the current rising build costs as appraisals will be out of date? I guess that's where the contingency comes in. Obviously, we're building inflation into our cost plans as well, but
yeah, so given the current market, we're building in both inflation and a contingency, and a higher contingency at that. I think pre-COVID, everything, banks were quite happy with like a 3 to 5% contingency. Some banks are wanting a minimum of 10, but most want at least north of 5, so between 5 and 10%. I think most of ours are at like between 7 and 10. I think I had 5 in that appraisal you saw, but yeah, just a higher contingency as well. But there will be some people that entered contracts at one point in the year and are having to renegotiate them because, to be honest, speaking to a lot of people in the construction industry, what's going on in the current market hasn't happened in really most people's sort of, I guess, lifetime, you could say. It's a very unusual thing that's happening at the minute. A lot of factors causing it, won't go into it. So it is one of those things that if something like this happens, you could be in a situation where you have to renegotiate contracts because, you may not have been able to appraise and forecast what's happened.
Cool. There's a few questions, guys, coming in that we did answer yesterday. So if you haven't yet watched the replay from yesterday, just to save us repeating ourselves a few times, we can check that out. A good point from Rachel. In the first session, we were advised not to project manage the construction, yet this session talked about us being paid to project manage. So I guess Rachel's referring to where we talked about it's preferable to have a mains contractor over a subcontractor. So do you want to explain what the difference between the two is and how you can still project manage it and have a mains contractor? Yeah, so a mains contractor is essentially handing over the build to someone else entirely, and they will just do the entire thing for you. A subcontract approach is you will have to procure the materials, you'll have to sort every contractor out. Basically, you're doing everything. But
basically what I'd say is, most people are going to use some sort of funding on sites and they expect to see a project management fee. So regardless, put one in because it gets you money out of that deal throughout the process. That's a cash flow. Some banks won't allow as high of a project management fee if it's a mains contractor because they'll be aware you're not doing anywhere near as much. So they might say actually you can only have 2% rather than the 4%, which I showed. But you'd try and have the 4% if the appraisal allows for it. But you do still have to manage a mains contractor. You still have to turn up to site, make sure the quality is where it needs to be, attend site meetings, work with your employer's agent to issue the contracts. There is still an element of management. It's just not that same day-to-day management. So yeah, you'd still have a project management fee, even if perhaps it has to be slightly lower because the bank won't allow it. But, you are still managing a project, just not, as day-to-day.
Cool. Adam asked, he mentioned, I've been searching for plots. I have found many that are charity owned or owned by the council. They tick all the boxes, but are these sites worth approaching? Also, can we please have a copy of the appraisal spreadsheet, which I've seen a few people ask for as well?
So anything owned by charities or governments, it's a difficult one. They have to be seen to act in the best interest of the public, which means they can't sell things off market. So they have to publicly sell it with an agent, basically, to be seen to get the best value. So for that reason, I tend to recommend not really, unfortunately, because, like I say, you just don't really get the best deals. And unfortunately, no, the appraisal sheet doesn't get given away for free. That's that's obviously there's the appraisal sheet is a combination of a few different documents all working synced together, and that's something provided on paid coaching. And as much as we'd love to give it away on the bootcamp, I think it'd be unfair for paying students, unfortunately. But it's something that you guys can obviously make your own version of as well.
Make your own version, but there are some added complexities to that. We've invested a lot of time and also money developing that and making sure some of the calculations, especially around the financing, are as accurate as possible. The next question, we've got a bit of a more technical question. I'm not sure who this is from, but it's how about the impact of ground conditions on type of foundation, shallow or deep at appraisal stage? A site on soft alluvium will surely need deep piled foundations. Yeah,
so in terms of foundations, you can have 3 key types. I suppose you could say 4. Strip or sort of concrete pad foundation, which is your most surface level, assuming you hit, it's called good strata, in normally about 2.5 meters. If it's not good beyond that, you might need some ground stabilization techniques like vibro foundations, and as you mentioned, if it's particularly poor, or it doesn't even have to be particularly poor ground, it could be a particularly large building, so tall buildings, because of the top-down load bearing, are also going to need piles. So you wouldn't have done a intrusive ground test at this point, typically. So you can offer subject to good ground conditions. So there is assumption that, obviously if the conditions come back bad, you would renegotiate. But to be honest, one thing I always say, and if you're building a really big building, the price per square foot that you put in the build cost will allow for things like the piles from the BCIS data. But one thing I always say is, if you've got those really big margins, like I showed, if you offered £500,000 for that site that was worth 950, the margin was like 30%, let's say. So if you did need piles, it wouldn't be a whole site. Very rarely would a whole site need piling. It will be elements of the foundations. You'd have a detailed foundation design from the architect. It can absorb the cost, quite frankly. It's not a nice situation to be in. You'd obviously rather not pay it. But what I'd say is it'd have to be a really big site. Very rarely are ground conditions that bad that it cripples a deal if the margin's in the deal. It'll cripple a deal if you're just on the viability cusp, or it could. But also, if you need vibro foundations, for example, yes, the vibro piling becomes more expensive, but the actual strip of concrete you then put on top of the vibro is less. So you save money in that sense. So, it's on rare occasions that it's this absolute nightmare disaster that you hear of. It's normally because people have overpaid for land that it becomes a nightmare disaster. Sorry, I used probably some quite technical terms there for people that didn't understand, but yeah.
And I'm sure you could talk about foundations for much, much longer.
Which Tyler would love to hear.
So a couple more technical questions. A Steps asked, do you operate under a traditional or design and build contracts? Do you ever take the employer's agent role on in-house or not want to get bogged down in the admin?
Yeah, good questions. We go with a design and build rather than a traditional build contract. The reason is, although by nature a design and build typically means they're actually going to design the scheme entirely, we don't use it for that. We give them a design scheme to the point of detailed working drawings with architects involved, obviously architects' involvements, engineers' involvements. But by having a design and build, it means that they have an element of flexibility in the materials used, construction methods. Basically, as long as they deliver this that we agree on, they can be a bit flexible, which allows them to drive the cost down. If you just give a fixed build contract, unless you've got a really good team from a construction element to cost engineer, the entire build, because it's just a build contract, they don't have that design flexibility. If they did deviate from the design you give, you could sue them basically. So they're not going to be willing to deviate, even if it does mean a cost saving. So I favour a design and build because it just gives that bit of flexibility to allow us all to cost engineer, the cost down where sensible. And then the employer's agent role, I prefer to outsource it because one, getting bogged down, but two, it adds in another layer of protection from their PI cover, because we then have someone else, that's someone else conducting a very important role within the business and the construction process. And if they mess it up, having an external company means we have someone else's PI cover to claim on. In the event someone, if someone doesn't do their job and it's not my fault, then I'd like to be able to, if there are legal ramifications for that, by having it outsourced, that gives me comfort.
Another question from Gerard about professional fees. So he said, I noticed that the professional fees were calculated on a percentage basis rather than a set fee. Is this common in property development?
Yeah, so particularly for the construction phase, your architecture package for planning tends to be on quite commonly tends to be on a fixed, I'll say it's £20,000, but for construction, it does tend to be as a percentage of the construction value, and that's the construction, not the construction and contingency. It's that raw construction value.
Another question which will give you an opportunity to talk about foundations again. Graham asks, can sites in flood zones be viable?
So they can. It depends on the flood zone and how much of it is a flood zone. Sometimes you can design the site so that the natural sort of drainage and attenuation ponds just sit in the most severely affected area, so you're not actually building there anyway. But basically, one of the most common mitigation strategies is actually just to build up the finished floor level, so it's not as much the foundations. It's what you see out of the ground. So that what you call DPC, damp proof course, which if you've ever seen brickwork, it's like the little blue polythene layer that goes under. That just sits higher out the ground basically, so your front door sits a step up than a standard house would. It's almost like building it up a little bit to lift it out of the ground.
An interesting question from Joel, and I guess there's not really a right or wrong answer to this, but he said, what's the best career to get into as a stepping stone to be a developer, either a land agent or a site manager? Yeah,
there's not one. A QS background is good to understand the quantity surveying, so that's like a lot of employers agents are also QSs, so that's quite a good role and teaches you a lot of the basics. Site manager's good because you will understand all the moving parts and also get a good network of contacts and also being able to never underestimate the ability to get on with people on site, tradesmen, being able to form a good relationship with them is invaluable. And having grown up on building sites, I could always spot someone who walks onto a site having never been on a building site, because instantly the way the tradies treat them, you can just they're the ones that they send them to, to the builder's merchant for spirit level bubbles, things like that. So yeah, site manager. Tartan paint is a classic one.
And a long wait.
A long wait. So site manager's great. It depends, because obviously, if you're looking at a career prior to it, you want to enjoy that process as well. So it's what you think you would enjoy. But yeah, anything like a land agent, site manager, QS would give you a good standing to have the knowledge base.
Cool. We're going to do one last question, guys, before we wrap up here. Again, we may do a Q&A in the Facebook group tomorrow, so make sure you've joined. I'll post the link in just a second. But last question from Graham. What do you base the 2% management fee on? Is it the total GDV or whatever the main contractor is charging? Please clarify.
Yeah, so your project management fee is on construction value. So if that was with a mains contractor, it would be on it'd be on the total contract price. Or if it's subcontract, it'd be the total construction price. Construction price, not the contingency as well. So that would be calculated on the exact same amount that your professional fees are calculated upon.
Yeah.
Good questions, guys. I like interesting questions like that.
Here we go. There are a couple more. Do a couple more. Brebois said a sky hook as well. When you're going to get some spirit level bubbles, get a sky hook.
Hook.
Mike also said a left-handed screwdriver.
Yeah.
I
can say that because my brothers, the bricklayers, sent me to a builder's merchant, and I asked for spirit level bubbles when I was younger. So been there.
Someone asked about insurances. What insurances do you need to operate as a developer?
Good question. You need public liability first and foremost, professional indemnity insurance. So you'll need professional indemnity insurance as a company. The land will need public liability insurance on the day of completion. And then you might need things like vacant building insurance if there's a building on site prior to completion. Obviously you need insurance for any plant or machinery you've got. Can you think of any of us? Typically what I do, I work with a broker, basically, an insurance broker. I put them the deal forward and they'll say, based on the intricacies of this deal, there might be like an indemnity policy needed, for example. So on the site we're actually buying, the timescales for completion slipped, so our searches ran out. So we're having to get an indemnity policy for our searches for the bank. So the insurances will change from site to site. So yeah, that's where I always say rely on a professional team. I turn around to my broker, Henry, and say, what do I need? And he goes out and gets the quotes.
Cool. Okay, guys, so we're going to wrap it up there for this evening. Again, thanks all for showing up, and well done for showing up.
Yeah, well done on a Tuesday evening.
Look out for the Facebook post in the Facebook group, which will go in the next 10 minutes, where you can obviously enter the competition. All we want to know is, what was your light bulb moment this evening? What was the one key piece of information that really stuck out for you? And where you can send us a selfie of where you're watching this from. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. The recording for yesterday's session, if you haven't watched it, is on the YouTube channel and also on the Facebook group. The recording for this one will also be emailed to you as well. And then we're here same time tomorrow, if you guys are ready to make this a reality. And
yeah, if you're still interested, if you haven't bored you yet.
if you're still interested.
If the talk of foundations wasn't enough.
Tomorrow is definitely the most interesting session, I would say. Raising finance,
like the finance bit, don't you?
Is a really interesting topic, especially around development, and that's really what can allow you to get into the bigger deals, understanding how to raise finance. So we will see you guys tomorrow.
Yes, see you tomorrow.